Right, then it's my great pleasure to ask Professor Peter Ryan to come up and present the Gill Memorial Medal Award for 2013. Thank you.
Thanks, Bert, and then really making me work on my last AGM here. But, this one's a pleasure to do, I must say. This is kind of like the Oscars for ornithologists in Southern Africa, and given where we are this year, I think it was really a very simple decision for the selection committee to select the recipient, and it's my considerable pleasure to read out the nomination document. So the recipient of the Gill Memorial Award for 2013 is Professor Rob Crawford from the Department of Environmental Affairs. Over the last 40 years, Rob has made a major contribution to our understanding of seabird population dynamics, and in particular the importance of fisheries and other human impacts on their conservation. At a time when many government officials have given up in the face of an increasingly difficult working environment, Rob has stubbornly continued to not only produce excellent research, but also to fight tirelessly for the conservation of Southern Africa's seabirds. Rob was born in Kenya quite a while ago and trained as a zoologist at the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg and obtained his BSc honours in 1970. He then went straight away to work at the then Sea Fisheries Research Institute in Cape Town, and a few weeks ago I was privileged to be at Rob's retirement party from Sea Fisheries, and there were some very entertaining anecdotes which I could amuse you with, but I think you've been sitting here long enough, so perhaps over the bar later tonight we can regale some of Rob's more amusing stories from the early days when he joined Sea Fisheries. But suffice to say that he was only appointed chief scientist on one sampling trip. Every piece of equipment he threw over the side of the ship never came back, so they never put him in charge of a sampling trip again. Rob remained at the Sea Fisheries Research Institute throughout the 1970s and obtained his PhD from the University of Cape Town in 1979 on the pelagic fish stocks of the Western Cape. He then had a short stint as an ecologist with the National Parks Board based in Tsitsikamma National Park before returning to Sea Fisheries in 1982, and he remained there despite all the organisational reshuffles that have plagued the institution since then. Over his long and distinguished career, Rob has published close to 300 papers and several books, including co-editing the influential Oceans of Life of Southern Africa with Andy Payne. His scientific contribution has grown with each decade, despite increasing demands on his time for management activities. He's also served on numerous scientific committees and working groups, including on the editorial boards of several scientific journals. More importantly, he chaired the steering committee for Saffring, seeing it through some very difficult financial straits, and played various advisory roles at Sankob. Apart from his research on pelagic fish and the functioning of the Benguela ecosystem, Rob's major contribution to seabirds and their conservation started with a series of papers that he wrote with Peter Shelton, John Cooper and Richard Brooke, summarising the breeding distributions and population sizes of Southern Africa's seabirds. These papers highlighted the importance of fisheries on seabird population dynamics and provided an essential baseline for much subsequent work. Another focus of Rob's early research, which was very prescient, was the recognition of the importance of long-term data sets, and he's worked assiduously to ensure the development and maintenance of such data sets for Southern Africa's seabirds, tracking both their populations and diet. Rob's pioneering work gained extra emphasis with the passing of the Marine Living Resources Act in 1998. This required South Africa to adopt an ecosystems approach to fisheries management and was influenced by the strong empirical evidence from seabirds showing the impact of single species fisheries management on other elements in the ecosystem. In the 1990s, Rob also extended his research arena to the Southern Ocean, taking responsibility for South Africa's contributions to CAMELAR under the Antarctic Treaty and initiating regular surveys of seabirds breeding at the Prince Edward Islands. He used his position to ensure that South Africa drafted a national plan of action to reduce seabird bycatch by longline fisheries and was instrumental in getting South Africa to accede to the agreement on the conservation of albatrosses and petrels. He has since led South Africa's delegation to meetings of ACAP parties and advisory committee meetings. In 1999, Rob was awarded the Gilchrist Medal for his contributions to marine research in Southern Africa, and in 2004 he was appointed as an honorary associate professor at the University of Cape Town. As I say, he retired earlier this year from Oceans and Coasts, but such is the esteem with which his contribution is appreciated within this department, he's been offered a 3-year contract extension, and we can only hope that he accepts this contract and continues to help to conserve South Africa's seabirds. It gives me great pleasure to announce that Rob Crawford is the recipient of this year's Gill Memorial Award.
Well, I don't really know what to say, but I thank Peter and BirdLife very, very much. It's an exceptional honour to receive the award, and I'm not at all worthy of it, and I just want to thank very many people who have done a lot of hard work over many years. In the top left, I think, as you look at it, you'll see a team that surveyed the seabirds at the Prince Edward Islands in 2001, and you might recognise that tall gentleman in the back row, Peter, and next to him on his right, Phil Whittington and so on. Bruce Dyer's there. So that group on the top right was on a survey of Latham Island off Tanzania in the mid part of the last decade. And so really, all the work on seabirds has been very much teamwork, and I want to thank all those who have helped and assisted and contributed to the conservation of seabirds. Down at the bottom left, you'll see my gorgeous wife, Phyllis, and she's been absolutely terrific. And you'll also see my two sons, Peter and David, on Kirton's Rock, with no penguins around, unfortunately, as they were when Kirton stood on that rock at Dasson Island about 1930. But it's not only people, it's also organisations, and there's so very many that I'm indebted to, and I list some of them up there. I do want to thank my department, the Department of Environmental Affairs, which really does take a keen interest in responsible management of our oceans, and BirdLife very much. You'll see it's BirdLife International, and I won't hesitate to say that at international treaties such as the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels, the work of BirdLife is terrific, and it's also terrific from the government's point of view, because without Ross Wanless and his team, we wouldn't have nearly been able to meet our obligations under the treaty, but with the team, we have been meeting those obligations. And more recently, local bird clubs, and particularly BirdLife Trogon's Bird Club has been invaluable in contributing data regarding seabirds around our coast, and that was thanks to David Allen. So we've heard a lot about the conservation status of our seabirds, and I feel even more of a fraud standing up here, because 67% of Southern African seabirds have an unfavourable conservation status. And in the time that I've been working with the Department of Environmental Affairs, I think we've managed to lose 150,000 pairs of macaroni penguins, 100,000 pairs of southern rockhopper penguins, 100,000 pairs of Cape gannets, and 50,000 pairs of African penguins and Cape cormorants. But Peter gave a wonderful talk on conservation of our seabirds yesterday, so I thought, with your indulgence, I might just talk a little bit about change and Southern Africa's seabirds. And we've been seeing some big change in the region that we live in. So this is a picture of Southern Africa, and if I can get this to work, particularly important is this region around the coast here that's coloured in blue or green, which are the cooler sea temperatures that we have. In the north we have a lot of red water, or warmer temperature, and as Peter pointed out yesterday, we also have a lot of warm water coming down with the Agulhas current. And our seabirds are really breeding in the cooler water that surrounds Southern Africa, and there are 4 major groups of breeding localities. The northernmost are the guano platforms in the Walvis Bay, Swakopmund and Cape Cross vicinity. And then we've got the southern Namibian islands, which we've been sailing past. And then we've got the seabird islands off the Western Cape and the seabird islands in Algoa Bay. If we look at one of our species, the Cape gannet, what we find is that in the 1950s, about when I started work, not quite, but 80% then were in Namibia. But there's been this change. South Africa had 20% of the gannets and now has 90% of them, with only 10% left in Namibia. And that really has reflected a change in the distribution of fish, when most of the fish in these earlier years were in Namibia, and now most of the fish are in South Africa. If we go to South Africa then, we find that this trend is continuing. In the 1980s, about 50% of South Africa's gannets were in the Western Cape and about 50% in the Eastern Cape. But now, some 80% of South Africa's gannets are in the Eastern Cape and just 20% in the Western Cape. So, as Peter mentioned yesterday as well, there's been a shift in the distribution of the fish on which a lot of the seabirds prey from off South Africa's west coast onto the south coast. And what that has meant is that the breeding localities for the seabirds are now dislocated from where the fish are. And that's had some severe implications for our birds. Now, has this shift in fish being due to fishing or due to the environment? Well, I think it's widely recognised that the pelagic fish were overexploited, unfortunately, in Namibia, so that a lot of seabird populations there crashed. And it's a little bit more complex in South Africa because we still have a fairly large biomass of anchovy, but it's mostly between these breeding localities. And we have had some of the birds that don't feed on the commercially exploited fish have been expanding their range towards the east, including these two, the Hartklub's gull and the crown cormorant. So that suggests that it's probably a combination of environmental change and fishing that has reduced many of our seabird populations. So these are a couple of species that we have that don't compete with fisheries for food, and they've been pretty stable over the last 30 odd years, thankfully. If we move to some of the species that do compete with fisheries for food, the gannet competes with the purse seine fishery, which mops up lots of sardine and anchovy, but it scavenges behind demersal trawlers where they're able to eat discarded hake or hake that escape. And that has helped it, in some respect, to maintain and even increase its population in South Africa, but there has been a big loss of birds in Namibia. And overall, the gannet population has decreased by 100,000 breeding pairs. But some of our seabirds that compete with fisheries have had these massive decreases. The African penguin, the Cape cormorant, and the bank cormorant, which in South Africa feeds largely on rock lobster, which has also had an eastward displacement in its distribution. So our birds are having to cope with a lot of change. And it's leading to some unfortunate circumstances. For instance, the Cape gannet, 80% of the Cape gannets are now at Bird Island in Algoa Bay, which is not exactly a situation we'd like to have, with most of the gannets just at one locality. But that is the reality, and they're also being squeezed now against the warm water there, so not much scope for them to continue to shift to the south and east around southern Africa. The African penguin did attempt to establish a mainland colony at De Hoop as the fish moved to the east, but it was unsuccessful because of predation, and we're seeing in the Western Cape at the moment that the best performing colonies are on the mainland, particularly at Boulders and Betty's Bay. So we have this unfortunate situation that 30% of the penguins in the Western Cape are breeding at the mainland, which makes them susceptible to all sorts of mainland issues, like the caracal here, which didn't allow the penguins to colonize at De Hoop. And this is another mainland colony not occurring around, a mainland predator not occurring around the coast, but I put it in for Mark. And then we'll just move down to our Prince Edward Islands, where there's also considerable change. This is Marion Island and Prince Edward Island in the sub-Antarctic South-West Indian Ocean. And we've We've also been seeing some rather disconcerting trends. Here's a couple of the species that feed close to the islands. They feed on very much the same prey, fish and shrimp that aren't exploited by fisheries. But they've both been decreasing and showing these very similar trends, which suggests that there's some change in the ecosystem there that's driving their populations down. We heard Peter today talk about crested penguins. South Africa has 2 of these at the Prince Edward Islands, the southern rockhopper penguin and the Macaroni penguin, and they too have just been decreasing very rapidly over the last 2 decades. We know from measuring penguins, the weight of penguins that return to the islands to breed. As Peter mentioned, these birds, they leave the islands in winter. They spend about 6 months away from the islands before they come back to breed. And what we've been seeing with the rockhopper penguin is the mass at which they're coming back to breed has decreased over time by about 20%, which isn't at all a good thing for penguins that spend a lot of their breeding period fasting. And so their reproductive success has deteriorated and their populations have been decreasing. This slide shows the distributions of crested penguins in the southern Indian Ocean from different colonies. These are the Prince Edward Islands that are South African territory, and then there's the Crozet Islands, the Kerguelen Islands, and St. Paul and Amsterdam, which are French territories. And the Macaroni penguin has been not feeding to the south of our islands, not coming back thinner. There's some other factor influencing its decrease at Marion Island, but the rockhopper penguins have been feeding up here, most of them. So we know that that's the portion of the ocean that is responsible for their coming back much thinner and lighter than they used to be. We don't know much more than that at the moment, but we know it will be an important area to look after into the future. And we're collaborating with France to try and introduce some protection into that region. So that's basically all I want to say. Just conclude with this slide from Psalm 104, which says, Lord, you have made so many things. There is the ocean large and wide, where countless creatures live, large and small alike. And we do hope that whoever comes in as my successor will do a better job than I have done, and that we'll be able to stabilise our seabird populations. Thank you again, BirdLife. Thank you, Mark, Peter, for the award. And thank you for all your partnership in the conservation of seabirds. From government's side, it's very, very much appreciated.
Worse off if you haven't been there in those years. We do appreciate what we've done. And this is for services to ornithology, research of birds in southern Africa. We've been instituting a new award, which was approved at Council yesterday. You'll hear about it next AGM, about contributions to conservation. Rob, thanks very much for being here with us, and congratulations again. Thank you.